Okay, guys, we're back here with part two of our Chapter 5 lectures, looking at the ethnic map and ancestry of the United States. So there's a few that should jump right out at you, and I will talk about a couple of the major ones, but let's look at least a couple of terms here with the ethnic homelands versus the ethnic islands. So when you see, for instance, the Dutch right here. So coming from the Netherlands, they're here in western Michigan, and a couple of counties out here in Iowa that I can, quickly discern. We can also see some of the Indian dominant areas here in, say, North Carolina. I think this is Cherokee, North Carolina, and certainly from the Trail of Tears that we talked about earlier, the ones that are out here in Oklahoma, and then the Lakota Sioux and the other mountainous tribes, the Cree and others, I think, out here. What do we have here? What's this group? The Spanish. Okay, so this is around Taos and Albuquerque and all of New Mexico. Those are pretty neat places. This was out in Comanche country, too, by the way, Comanche Empire. They ruled a big area out in here. I will end up talking here in just a moment about the Mormons, also about the Irish, but I do want to look at the Black Belt here, this dominant area of Deep South African Americans, and like a lot of people think, okay, this is an English-speaking country, so most of the immigrants are British. No, they weren't. There's a lot of Irish and Scots-Irish. Well, they were, but they weren't number one either. Certainly lots of Africans came in through slavery and later some migrations. French, not so much. Who were the dominant group? It was the Germans, you guys, and they got their toehold right here in Pennsylvania. And you'd see a lot of the namesakes in this area being burghs. Sorry about that, the Bergs. And so a lot of the appellations that came from or all over this area were coming from Germany. So I needed to kind of see that. Certainly you again see here the Cuban. This is, sorry about that. This is distinctly because of the Fidel Castro and the communists taking over in 1959, Alston de Bautista, regime, and all of the richest of the Cubans left because they didn't want their money taken and distributed to everybody else. And they've been wanting to go back for quite some time, but, we haven't. We tried to kill Fidel Castro and others and tried to do various things to flip that state away from communism, but that never happened. And it's, I don't know. I'll leave it at that. But looking at those, these different groups that you'd find out in here, whether they're Norwegian, when you ask, well, why are there so many Norwegians or Finns out here? Well, start to look at what the geography of the physical areas look like and look at the latitude of them, and it'll tell you this is close to 60 degrees north latitude. This is exactly where Oslo is, for instance, in Norway, and this is exactly, aside from being landlocked in here, where they are in the northern part of North Dakota and Montana here, this northwestern part of Minnesota, obviously they don't have the fjords and fishing, but it's still the same kind of climate. So that should just make sense to you, okay? So ethnic homelands and islands. Well, let's look at the Irish in America real fast. This is a picture from up in Boston, so you know about Boston, and the number of Irish that came in there. If you look on the bottom, I found this article, and of course it was written exactly as Donald Trump talked about Mexicans, for instance, that they brought with them crime and race. They were rapists and they were undesirables. Just because they're white doesn't mean that they weren't an alien race, if you will, and certainly that they were Catholic was the biggest of the problems. And when you talk about FDR, it wasn't his youth; it was the fact that people were worried I said FDR. I'm sorry, JFK, John F. Kennedy. They weren't necessarily worried about I mean, they called it Camelot afterwards, but they were really worried about him taking orders from the Pope, and he had to come out and actually say, "No, the Pope is not going to tell me what to do. I'm an independent thinker," even though he was very strongly Catholic. So certainly the Irish coming from straight from Ireland were Catholic. Now, a lot of people living in this area of the South are Scots-Irish, which means they came from Scotland. They're Protestants. They lived in Ireland for a while before they hitched a ride over and came to America. So that's a little bit different. If you go to Boston, though, it's really cool to walk through the town. We walked across the entire city, but they have a whole lot of statues in that city about the Irish immigrants that came in, and certainly a lot of it was associated with the potato famine. They had like something like 8 million people there when the famine hit. 2 million died and 2 million left, I think is what ended up happening. And those 2 million came to America. They didn't have an easy time of it. That said, though, this is in the county. This picture that you're seeing right now, this is in a county where I grew up. This is a little town called McEwen, and there's a Catholic church there, and they have what's called the Irish picnic. And so this is a huge deal. You have to go online and look at all the pictures and stuff. It was unfortunate this year because of COVID, there was nobody there. I wanted to take my nephew for the first time. He was excited to see it. I had my fingers crossed something was happening. They had nothing going on. But this is how that Catholic school there in Little McEwen, Tennessee operates, by selling pork shoulders and pulled pork and barbecued chickens and everything else. They have games and rides and you name it. But there's a fairly strong Irish community in that area. And so when you look here, north of where I grew up in Humphreys County, so that's where McEwen and Waverly, which is where I'm from. But then if you look just north of where my grandparents came from, they were in Erin, okay, Erin. They have their own, Shamrock and Irish festivals there too in Houston County. So if I drop back to that map real quick, let me see. So when you look in this area right here, you're certainly seeing an American mixing, a melange. But that little spot right there, that's Houston County. That's the one I'm talking about. So it has a strong Irish contingent. And certainly some of these other counties here, it looks like, that's really small, but that looks like that's Sumner County. So I think that matches up, but maybe yeah, it looks like it does. But I'm not from Sumner County, and now that I've thought of it, I don't even know. So maybe that's something I should start looking up. We all have things to learn, right? Okay, so that's the Irish in America. And by the way, finally here, to leave you with this depiction, you look at how Japanese were depicted in World War II. Often in World War One, the Germans were depicted as guerrillas wearing those Pickelhaube, those helmets with the spikes on them. The Japanese were very much racist, buck teeth, big glasses, eyes. These are depictions of the people that we don't like. This is actually a depiction of the Irish. They're drunk all the time. They're louts. They're criminals. And so think about the nativism, the people. And I'm sorry to say it like this, but this is what Donald Trump is playing with here. That fear, the xenophobia of the outsider, those other people, they're not like us. And playing with nativism this is not a brand new playbook. It's been here for a very long time. And we're actually even going to see it in other places too. Now, with the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, I want to tell you about them real quick. The Mormon Trail is the jumping off point was in Illinois before they ended up out in what would become Utah. But look at it, Deseret. If you ever see somebody driving around with Utah tags, you need to know they're the beehive state. And it's not because of agriculture. It's because they were a community of people who threw in together. And what that meant, it was very communal. Now, the sticking point for a lot of people was that they were, Joseph Smith believed in polygamy. And that certainly was a problem for people, but another problem was, when economic times got bad and yet the Mormons are succeeding over there, people would be upset about that, but that's the way their colonies worked. The picture that you see here, I don't know if you can make it out, but this was in National Geographic. So this gentleman right here is with his 5 wives. He's a LDS, but FLDS, fundamentalists, and these are not recognized in the mainstream, and polygamy, which they still practice, is still against the law and shunned. This is his wives, his children, his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren. All those people right there you see in that picture are of, aside from his wives, are from his DNA. So these people still operate, and you say, how is that fair? How is that legal? How is that right? Well, imagine that they're in those communities with other Mormons. There's a lot of laws on the books that people just aren't going to, we're going to overlook this because that was seen as the norm, and this is the origin of it. And so this is where the core area is. It's out in that Wasatch Range, this red area right here. Donald Meinig, a geographer, did this cultural study. So the Wasatch Range is this mountain range right here, and there's a lot of water that falls in this area, snow and rainfall. They don't get their water from the Salt Lake. This is where all of the drainage happens here, and so as the water evaporates, the salt content goes up. You can't drink the water. But the point is, though, they're in these windward ranges, which get a lot of rainfall, so they could make a go of it. And so when you look here too, where did they start? Well, they start up in Palmyra, New York, before they're finally run out of there. They moved to Kirtland, Ohio, eventually get to Nauvoo, Illinois, which is where Joseph Smith and his brother are finally killed by a mob. Then you have Brigham Young taking off, and the Mormon Trail, and finding their livelihood out in the middle of a place that shouldn't be blooming, but they made it work because they did have a good work ethic. Okay. And another thing to consider here with polygamy too, with men fighting, men dying a bit more often, this is something that Christians, Muslims, and others do. What do? You take care of widows and orphans. So I don't want to be too harsh on anyone in this regard. Now, when we look at Aryan racial superiority, you better believe I'll get hard on this stuff. Be hard on those individuals because I don't see. I'm white, but I don't see myself as superior to anyone, nor would I find anyone superior to me. However, when you look at these two terms, Lebensraum, which was brought to you by a German geographer, his name was, you'll want to remember this, Frederick Ratzel. He wasn't a racist in this way. He just talked about the evolution of countries in like a biological context, and that Germany was going to grow, and Hitler, of course, would take this, even as he had a Jewish grandmother, would take this and roll this up into his ideas about Aryan superiority. So the two groups that he really focused on, not Ratzel, but Himmler, I think you see it down here, Himmler with the Lebensborn, was to, now it's in another slide, but you wanted German women of good racial stock. You also wanted Norwegians. They really looked at those Norwegian women, and they were going to be birthing the dominant race, and that's what they did. Think about how difficult this would be for the children born of those unions. It was. I'm sorry, I'm losing traction here, but it's phenomenal to look at some of this stuff. So the area that's called Lebensraum, or living space, is this area out here to the east. So what Hitler and the Nazis were looking for was an area which was Germanic long ago, but then was taken up by Slavic-speaking peoples, which they thought were Untermenschen, subhumans. They would even look, when we're going to talk about genocide in a moment, they would look at the Jews as rats, as vermin. And if you'll name those kinds of people, the people that you don't like, I'm speaking from the German Nazi standpoint, if you call them things like rats and vermin, well, don't you catch and kill rats? You don't want them in your house. You don't want them living there. So you dehumanize the population. So we're going to analyze that a bit more. But imagine again, too, what it would be like to be carrying as progeny, a ward of the state, really. And what do these children are alive today, what do they feel like, coming from this? And so wrapping up here, I wanted to let you know, Heinrich Himmler here, they wanted these purebred Aryan children, so they used phrenology. It's quackery. It's not science, but they would measure noses. They would measure forehead slopes and brow ridges and all these things. It's pseudoscience. It's not science at all. And so in those claimings, then of course they're going to have what Hitler wanted, and that was a new dominant race, even though obviously he would not have been part of it. All right, I'll see you in part 3 in just a moment. Bye bye.